Welcome to my podcast series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. This is video number 41, and in this video we're going to take a look at the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were a patriotic organization of colonists who opposed British policies and eventually became the tip of the spear in the movement for independence. We're also going to take a look at some of their methods and some of the activities they did in some of the larger cities in the colonies, except for Boston. I believe that Boston, being the epicenter of colonial resistance, deserves its own particular podcast video, and so I'm going to do one down the road just on Boston and the Sons of Liberty there. But in this podcast, we'll take a look at all the other colonies and cities. The Sons of Liberty had their origins as the leaders in resistance to the Stamp Act of 1765. Their name appears to have been given to them by, ironically enough, a member of the British Parliament, a guy named Isaac Barry. Barry had been an officer in the British Army and served in North America during the French and Indian War, and he was pretty sympathetic towards the colonists and usually spoke in their defense. In February of 1765, the British Parliament was debating whether or not to impose a stamp tax on the colonists, and Isaac Barry stood up in their defense. He first talked about how crummy the officials were, royal officials that had been sent to govern the colonies, and made this comment, that the royal officials were sent to spy out their liberty, meaning the colonists' liberty, to misrepresent their actions, and to prey upon them, men whose behavior on many occasions has caused the blood of those sons of liberty to recoil within them. So Barry's speech was published far and wide in the colonial newspapers, and the phrase Sons of Liberty just seemed to stick to opponents who opposed some of the British policies that they felt were oppressive and unfair. Earlier I described the Sons of Liberty as an organization, but you have to understand that word in the loosest possible meaning when you're talking about the Sons of Liberty. There was no central leadership, and as far as I know, there was no membership roster or initiation ceremony or anything like that. It's probably easier to tell who the leaders were than the actual rank and file, because typically the leaders would announce some event or activity was going to happen, and then townspeople would be informed of it and then show up, and everyone there considered themselves to be a Son of Liberty. It's important to notice, too, that as things progressed towards independence, it was the Sons of Liberty that filled out the ranks of the rebel governments that seized control of each colony from British authority. So the Sons of Liberty weren't one single organization. However, each of the chapters in each colony were actively communicating and instructing each other in what to do. Governor Bull complained that some of the riots and activities going on in South Carolina were the result of influence from New England. He complained of some very extraordinary and universal commotions in the town. By the artifices of some busy spirits, the minds of men were universally poisoned with the principles which were imbibed and propagated from Boston and Rhode Island, from which towns at this time of the year vessels very frequently arrived. In another example, a guy named Zachariah Hood, who was the staff agent for Maryland, he had fled Maryland to avoid the Sons of Liberty there. He fled to New York for refuge, thinking he would be safer, but the Sons of Liberty there were already informed of who he was, they knew who he was, and he had to go to the governor to find refuge and safety. The communication and coordinating between these different Sons of Liberty groups and organizations becomes later the committees of correspondence. I'm going to do a whole podcast just on that because I think it's so important. These committees of correspondence become the nodes around which these rebel governments form and take control of each colony and kick out the royal officials. One of the things that made the Sons of Liberty so effective as revolutionaries was their willingness to resort to violence and intimidation. During the Stamp Act, for example, many of the Sons of Liberty forced royal officials and stamp collectors to come out of their homes and publicly resign their commission on the spot or face violence. Sometimes they were summoned to come and resign more than once, or maybe in public out by the Liberty Pole or Liberty Tree, where it was kind of a public spectacle. Officials who failed to comply with this often faced violence, which could include up to tar and feathering. They actually had committees of tar and feathering in some spots. And very frequently, it involved destruction of their homes and vandalism, or even burning their houses outright. So they literally terrorized royal officials into not enforcing the laws that Parliament passed. The Sons of Liberty were also big on symbols. In many of their demonstrations and riots, they would build a gallows and then hang an effigy of some royal official from it, maybe next to a devil. And of course, this could be quite intimidating if you were a royal official and charged with enforcing the law, and here's an effigy of you hanging from the gallows. And knowing that the Sons of Liberty are more than willing to resort to violence, you might think twice about trying to enforce the law or whether or not you want to even continue to have whatever office you are in. In some cases, they buried coffins with the word liberty written on the side to symbolize the fact that their liberties were being killed and buried by the king and his policies. Every city where the Sons of Liberty operated had either a liberty pole or a liberty tree. These liberty trees and poles served as a rallying point and often as a meeting place where the Sons of Liberty and their supporters met, and it was sometimes the place where activities were begun. In Boston, at the Liberty Tree there, they often hung effigies of officials they hated as kind of a mock hanging, hoping to intimidate these officials into resigning. British officials, when they could, often chopped down these poles and trees. In fact, in New York, they chopped down 4 Liberty poles until one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, a guy named Isaac Sears, he actually obtained a large ship's mast and put it in his front yard and cased the bottom of it with iron so it couldn't be chopped or sawed down. So you might wonder how this lawlessness went on. What did the governor do? Well, keep in mind that there were no actual British troops anywhere in North America for these British governors to use. They had to rely on the militia, and typically the militia was in the mob terrorizing the royal officials. So from one end of the continent to the other, they were basically impotent to stop the violence. Up in Massachusetts, Governor Bernard had to flee Boston and actually fled to the island where they had a little fort there for his own safety. And as far south as Georgia, Governor Wright had to summon the Rangers from the frontier to come in and protect his house against Sons of Liberty. Sometimes sheriffs were granted warrants to go arrest leaders of the Sons of Liberty, but they really knew there was no way to do it, and they couldn't. They didn't. They simply said, well, it's impossible to do or to enforce or to arrest these guys. I'd probably get killed in the process. So the Sons of Liberty really had free rein to run the streets and to riot as they saw fit and intimidate and terrorize royal officials. It's easy to see why the governors hated the Sons of Liberty so much, and you can see why Governor Wright of Georgia referred to them not as the Sons of Liberty, but as the Sons of Licentiousness. At this point, I thought it'd be a good idea to just survey some of the events that went on in the major cities, just to give you an idea and a flavor of how the Sons of Liberty operated to stop the Stamp Act from taking effect. In Newport, Rhode Island, which was heavily influenced by events in Boston, a mob of Sons of Liberty made the rounds going to the houses of various royal officials, plundering and vandalizing their houses. These officials knew that they were coming, and so they managed to flee down to the harbor and seek safe refuge on the Navy ships of the Royal Navy. In Charlestown, South Carolina, the Sons of Liberty erected a 20-foot high gallows in the most conspicuous part of town, and hanging from it an effigy of the stamp collector next to the devil. Next to this display they wrote, "Liberty and no Stamp Act. All internal duties imposed without the consent of representatives is grievous, oppressive, and unconstitutional. Whosoever shall dare attempt to pull down these effigies had better been born with a stone about his neck and cast into the sea." That evening the Sons of Liberty held a symbolic funeral. They had a coffin with the words American Liberty written on it, and they led a procession down to the cemetery with the bells of the churches ringing. And on the way, of course, they stopped at some royal officials' houses to try and rough them up. They had fled, but they vandalized their houses along the way before going to the cemetery and burying this empty coffin, symbolic of the fact that British policies were felt to be murdering and burying their liberties. In New York City, which was almost as turbulent and violent as Boston, the Sons of Liberty there posted handbills around town when the stamps arrived from Britain that said, "The first man that either distributes or makes use of stamp paper, let him take care of his house, person, and effects." They also came upon a scheme to steal the cannons from Fort George, where a Major James, who was one of the king's officers there, made this bold assertion. He said he would cram the stamps down their throats with the end of his sword, and that if they attempted to rise, he would drive them all out of the town for a pack of rascals with 24 men, which greatly inflamed, of course, public sentiment. Lieutenant Governor Colden, who was the acting governor, had to flee to Fort George for his own safety, and it wasn't long before a mob showed up there. A large mob came to Fort George and actually delivered a letter to Governor Colden, and it said, "To the Honorable Cadwallader Colden, Esquire, Lieutenant Governor of the City of New York. Sir, the people of the city and province of New York have been informed that you bound yourself under an oath to be the chief murderer of their rights and privileges by acting as an enemy to your king and country, to liberty and mankind, in the enforcement of the Stamp Act, which we are unanimously determined shall never take place among us so long as man has life to defend his injured country. Thus wicked men of old conspired against Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, and bound themselves under a curse that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed him. But God defeated their bloody purposes, as we trust he'll do yours, and Saul was delivered. How it fared with his intended assassins, history does not certainly inform us, but we can with certainty assure you of your fate if you do not this night solemnly make oath before a magistrate and publish to the people that you never will, directly or indirectly, by any act of yours or any person under your influence, endeavor to introduce or execute the Stamp Act, or in any part of it, and that you will, to the utmost of your power, prevent its taking effect here, and endeavor to obtain a repeal of it in England, so help you God. The letter also went on to warn the governor that if he had the Navy ships fire on the city, that you'll die a martyr to your own villainy and be hanged like patriots upon a signpost as a memento to all wicked governors, and that every man that assists you shall surely be put to death. So when you're talking about murdering a royal governor, you're talking about very serious business. So here the mob leaves the fort. They didn't fire on the mob, neither did the mob fire on the fort. They found that Governor Colden's coach house was open. They took one of his coaches out, put the effigy in the driver's seat, took it uptown to the bowling green, started a bonfire, and burned his coach. So in my last podcast, I specifically talked about the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act crisis, but in this podcast, I wanted to give you a little more detail about how the Sons of Liberty operated in some of the big cities and the intimidation tactics that they did. And I've only chosen here things they did during the Stamp Act riots, but you'll see in future events as they get closer to independence, they continue to do these kinds of things, and their methods don't really change any. Many modern Americans are shocked by the violence and intimidation inflicted by the Sons of Liberty. After all, these are our heroes. These are the guys that fought to get our independence. But we have to keep in mind that the times they lived in were more violent. There were riots in London during this time period too, and they were just as violent as any rioting that occurred here in North America. We also have to keep in mind that the Sons of Liberty genuinely believed that their rights and liberties were being taken from them, and they didn't feel that any amount of extremism was off the table in order to save their rights and protect themselves from encroachment and oppressive government. All right, in closing this short podcast, I do have questions I want to pose to the audience. I hope you'll leave a comment. These are things I've thought about as I have learned about the Sons of Liberty over the years and thought about their activities. The first question is, how is it that all 13 of the colonies developed chapters of the Sons of Liberty? Now think about it. Each colony was very different. They had their own customs and culture and economies. New Hampshire and Georgia were very different places, yet they both had chapters of the Sons of Liberty who were very active and resorted to the same kinds of methods. My own opinion is that American colonists were deeply influenced by English Whig political philosophy. I talked about this in previous podcasts. It permeated their political thinking and their ideas about constitutionalism. And I think they saw what the king was doing as encroaching on that. And I don't think they saw themselves as that much different than the people of England and what they had done in the prior century in beheading King Charles I. I also can't help but think that class envy was a little bit of a factor in this. Society was a little more stratified than it is now. And it was a little bit harder to move up socially, although if you earned enough money here in America, you could move up. But I think there was a lot of there was a lot of colonial resentment at always having British overlords who were not maybe sensitive to what they thought was important. So I do think there was some class envy operating, at least to some degree. And think about this too. The leaders of the Sons of Liberty were always generally higher-born people, and they relied on mechanics. And mechanics is a word that covers anyone who worked with their hands for a living. So if you made barrels or shoes or rope or anything like that, you were a mechanic. And it was the mechanics who did a lot of the rioting and a lot of the actual activities. The second question I'll pose is, why was there no popular opposition to the Sons of Liberty? Why isn't there an analogous organization, say, that was loyal to the king, the Sons of the King or something, the Sons of the King's Rights? There was nothing like that rose up to oppose the Sons of Liberty. There were no loyalist organizations that opposed them in the cities. That's a good question in itself, too. So leave your comments. I'd appreciate to hear them. Thanks. For further reading, I recommend the following books and articles. Charleston's Sons of Liberty, A Study of the Artisans, 1763 to 1789, by Richard Walsh. The Sons of Liberty in New York by Henry B. Dawson. The Violent Men, A Study of Human Relations in the First American Congress by Cornelia Meigs. The Sons of Liberty, The Lives and Legacies of John Adams, Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and John Hancock by Charles River Editors. Desperate Sons, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, John Hancock, and the Secret Bands of Radicals Who Led the Colonies to War by Les Standiford. The Albany Stamp Act Riots by Beverly McInerney, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 4, Number 4, October 1947. Cadwallader Colden and the New York Stamp Act Riots by F. L. Engelman, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 10, Number 4, October 1953. The Seeds from Which the Sons of Liberty Grew by Robert Rupert, published in the Journal of the American Revolution, December 8, 2014. The Sons of Liberty and Mob Terror by Jeffrey D. Simon, published in the Journal of the American Revolution, December 12, 2019. The Liberty Cap as a Revolutionary Symbol in America and France by Yvonne Korshak, published in the Smithsonian Studies in American Art, Volume 1, Number 2, Autumn 1987, and Growth of Revolutionary Parties and Methods in New York Province, 1765 to 1774, by Carl Becker, published in the American Historical Review, Volume 7, Number 1, October 1901,